name is Schluckebeir. I work for Think Tennessee, like Daniel mentioned. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit, statewide, results-oriented think tank based in Nashville. And we use research and advocacy to work to build a state where all Tennesseans are civically engaged and economically secure. So our work falls into those two categories: civic engagement, economic security. And my work, I focus on that civic engagement side. So like Daniel said, we're looking at the policies and the practices of civic engagement in our state, from the ways that we register to vote, we cast our ballots, and looking at why Tennesseans may or may not be voting. And our work is really based on the understanding that our state's policies, like every state's policies, have a real impact on things like ballot access. And it's important that we understand what that looks like in order to understand the story of civic engagement in our state. So we're looking mainly to the policies and the practices that are in place, examining how they might be impacting civic engagement, and looking to policies and practices in other states to see if there might be anything that we can learn from them. So part of the reason why I think Tennessee sort of wanted to and is focused on civic engagement is that Tennessee trails most other states, almost all other states, on those key indicators of engagement: voter registration and voter turnout. So in the last presidential election in 2016, Tennessee ranked 49th out of the 50 states in DC. So out of 51, Tennessee ranked 49th in voter turnout and 45th in voter registration. And then in the last federal election in 2018, the midterms, those rankings were 44th for turnout and 48th for voter registration. And it's not something, that started in 2016. It's a trend that goes back a couple of election cycles at least. So we wanted to understand sort of why and see what there might be to do about it. And part of that story involves looking at what those mechanics of voting look like. So how do we register to vote? Who is registered to vote or who can't register to vote? How can we cast our ballots? Things like that, sort of what systems are in place. The other part of that story really involves kind of looking at that individual level, right? Understanding, what is keeping someone from participating? Do they not see the value in their vote or feel the impact that it has on their daily lives? Or do they just not have the information that they need? So it's that sort of personal level experience. In fact, a poll from the last election cycle in 2018 showed that over 50% of Tennesseans at the time were confused about whether they were legally allowed to vote in given situations, things like having outstanding traffic tickets or if they weren't fluent in English. So there's a lot of information to know, and not knowing pieces of that really could be keeping some people from participating. So that's why all the efforts on the ground with government agencies and community members and businesses to really support voter education and awareness are key. Making sure that voters have the information that they need and that they feel equipped to participate is a really big part of the story. But in our work, we're looking primarily at that first part, at the systems. So we try to understand if there are ways that we might be able to do things differently, looking to see where those opportunities might be and how engagement might be impacted by some of those changes. So our paper that, as part of this series, examines one of those systems and practices, the process of voting rights restoration in Tennessee. So the voting restoration process for Tennesseans with felony convictions is a complicated one. And it's one that data shows is keeping about 1 in 12 voting age Tennesseans from voting. And that number is a little bit more stark when you look specifically at Black Tennesseans. It's about 1 in 5. So our paper, we talk a little bit about sort of what that process looks like. We compare it to other states, and we offer some recommendations for potential policy change. So without going too much into detail here, I'll just try to kind of touch on each of those pieces. Now, so compared to other states, starting there, in all but 2 states, Maine and Vermont, and every other state, residents lose the right to vote after a felony conviction. States differ in the process that those individuals go through in order to have their voting rights restored. So Tennessee is one of 11 states that require those with felony convictions to complete a series of steps beyond sentence completion in order to have their rights restored. In the other states, individuals are either eligible to register to vote after being released from prison, or after they've completed a parole or probationary period. So once the sentence is over, they can register to vote. In Tennessee, in addition to completing that sentence, which does include a parole or probation period, individuals must first pay these legal financial obligations. And these are things like court costs and any restitution that might have been ordered. So Tennessee is also the only state where child support is also part of that legal financial obligation equation. So an individual with a felony conviction is not eligible to register to vote until they are current on any child support debt. So there's kind of two important things to know about this. Until recently, Tennessee classified incarceration as voluntary unemployment, which means that child support debts continued to accrue while a parent was incarcerated. So someone entering prison current on child support could come out with tens of thousands of dollars in debt. And the average accrued debt actually from a year or so ago when we looked into this was $26,266. That was the average accrued child support debt for someone coming out of prison. And that could take years, if not decades, to pay off. So new guidelines were issued this year that have changed that. So that incarceration can no longer be considered willful or underemployment. So that's a new change this year. And the second thing to sort of keep in mind or consider is that child support debt is not a factor in eligibility for voter registration for anyone else, only for Tennesseans with felony conviction. So, someone going to register to vote who is behind on child support without a felony conviction, it doesn't factor into the equation. They're eligible. So we talked also in the paper a little bit about what the process looks like. Tennessee is one of 11 states that permanently disenfranchises individuals with certain convictions, so things like murder and voter fraud. Individuals convicted of other felonies may be eligible to have their voting rights restored, and that eligibility is based on the type of felony and the time of conviction. So this can be complicated because a person who's convicted of one crime in one time period may be eligible to have their rights restored, but someone convicted of the same crime in a different time period may not. So I won't sort of dive deeper and go into detail here, but there are some flowcharts in the paper that kind of outline those time periods and those crimes and what that means for eligibility. So that's the first process. Once a person determines that they're eligible, then they must complete this certificate of restoration to sort of certify your eligibility. So this form, the certificate of restoration, is completed by the incarcerating or the probation authority who essentially certifies that the sentence is complete. It's also completed by agents of the court who indicate that any court costs or restitution have either been paid or that they weren't assessed in the first place. And a separate certificate of restoration is needed for each felony conviction if there's more than one. So that certificate is presented to the person's local county election commission, where it's then passed on to the state election department to be verified. So part of that verification process includes the state checking with Department of Human Services to make sure that there's no outstanding child support payments that are owed. So after that is verified, the person then can complete a voter registration application with their county election commission. So there's a question on our voter registration application that asks about felony convictions. And with that certificate of restoration completed, the individual can indicate that they've had their rights restored. And then in terms of sort of policy change and policy recommendations, we're seeing a national trend really towards voting rights restoration. Most recently, in the last year or two or three, New York, Kentucky, Louisiana, Florida, and Iowa have made some changes to their restoration processes. So we're really seeing, policymakers and advocates really from across the ideological spectrum, really coming to see an improved reentry process, of which rights restoration is part, as a way to reduce the high recidivism rates and also save taxpayer dollars. So it's hard to draw that causal relationship between voting rights and reduced criminal behavior and recidivism. But there is some evidence demonstrating that connection. More research in that area as we continue to move forward would be extremely helpful. And we've seen some recent efforts, some local efforts here in the Tennessee General Assembly to modify the restoration process also. So the most recent bill was introduced this year. It would have provisionally restored voting rights to individuals with felony convictions who enter into a payment plan for those legal financial obligations that I mentioned. So being restored provisionally means that those rights could then be revoked again should that person become delinquent and fall behind on those payment plans. So that bill made it through the House, but it wasn't discussed in the Senate due to that sort of shortened COVID-19 impacted session. But that's sort of where things stand at the moment as of this most recent legislative session. So the specific recommendations that we made in our paper include streamlining the restoration process. So it's a complicated one to determine eligibility and then also to complete the certificate of restoration, like I mentioned. So streamlining the process would look like those different government agencies that are involved sort of being more connected to each other so as to better share information about who is eligible. We also recommended decoupling the legal financial obligations from the restoration and eligibility process so that you'd be eligible to vote, but those debts are still owed. It's just it doesn't impact your eligibility. And then more information about the number of individuals who are attempting to or successfully getting their rights restored could really help to sort of analyze the full impact of rights restoration on recidivism. So making that information more publicly available, both in our state and in other states as well, would be extremely helpful.